we're spending far too much money on nonsense rather than looking after the defence of our realm, which is, always should be, the first duty of government. I mean, the last government, of which I was a fairly vocal critic, refused to acknowledge that we must spend more on defence. We have to spend more on defence. We have to get back to where we were in the Cold War, because we're facing an adversary that is, there's actually on the move and attacking places like Ukraine, and could easily move on to the Baltic states, and indeed could move on to places like Poland and whatever. We need to be able to hold him off with a strong arm, and that may put him back in his box.
Do you think that the EU and, of course, the UK need to start thinking about their defence without the US assistance? We heard yesterday from several voices that actually that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, because the US provides bits of technology that actually are not available to the EU armed forces as such. So can the EU ever be independent of the US in terms of protecting its own territory?
Well, I think the problem has been over the last 80 years that we have allowed America to become the bastion of Western democracy in Europe. And it has been, I was in the army 50 years ago, and we were absolutely reliant on America there. We're reliant on America still. The problem has been that we have cut our defense spending dramatically and expected America to keep on spending a lot of money on defending Europe, which we have not done. We had, when I was serving in Germany 45 years ago, we had I think I'm right in saying 55,000 British soldiers facing east against the Warsaw Pact, mostly Russia, but led by Russia anyway. And we had X number of fighters. I don't know how many, but we had a huge bastion of defense against Russia, the Warsaw Pact as then was. Now we are in a different situation, but it doesn't mean the situation has changed. Russia continues to see a lot of Europe as its own territory, and it wants it back. And fun enough, if you were sitting in Latvia or Estonia or indeed Ukraine, you wouldn't much want to be ruled again by Russia.
Yesterday, the former head of the army, Lord Robathan, has been saying that actually the UK military is so run down that it could not lead to any future peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. Something that we are being given to understand by the Americans is going to be Europe's responsibility going forward with any peace deal. They have been very clear that it's not going to be US troops keeping Ukraine safe. What are your thoughts on Lord Robathan's comments? I mean, even with an injection of £5 billion with the increase from 2.3 to 2.5, is that going to be enough?
Well, it's not nearly enough. I'm afraid to say that Richard Dunn is right. The amount that needs to be spent on our defence is much greater than that. And $5 billion they're talking about just about covers inflation. In fact, we need to spend a huge amount more. The problem has been, if I might put it this way, Alexis, that for decades we have looked at defence and thought, well, hold on, this is just an insurance policy. We don't need it. Let's cut back on what we're spending on defence. But the thing about insurance policies is one day you need them, and we haven't been spending on defence. We haven't been for decades. We haven't been spending on defence, and I'm afraid we need to get our act together and spend a lot more money on defence, attract the right people in defence, keep the right people in defence, and actually spend a lot of money also on new technology, which I don't particularly well understand, but drones and things like that, which need to be spent to combat any future threat from, particularly at the moment, from Russia.
President Zelensky addressed the Munich Security Conference yesterday and called for a European army. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the idea of a European army is pretty bonkers, actually. It's not that we don't need more allies in Europe, and I think they must spend a lot of money on replacing them. But when I was serving, as again, I'm talking about over 40 years ago, we had a very fierce army. The French had a fierce army. The Germans were okay, but of course they were defending half their country, was then occupied by the Soviet Union. After that, I'm afraid the rest didn't really make a great deal of difference. Now, we have to spend a lot of money. Every country has to spend a lot of money and realize that actually you can have as many bloody hospitals as you like, but that's no good if you've got no electricity to run them, and indeed if you haven't got the people there. We need to completely change our attitude to defence and indeed to other things. And indeed, whilst I don't entirely agree with Mr. Vance, what he said over the last couple of days, he has made a very good point about the fact that we're spending far too much money on nonsense rather than looking after the defence of our realm, which is, always should be, the first duty of government.
How much of GDP do you think the government should be spending on defence?
Well, I'm not in a position to tell you exactly, but I certainly think we should be spending approaching double what we're spending now, at least, and looking to even greater sums. I can't tell you exactly how much it will cost.
I mean, the US spend 3.4%, and Donald Trump is saying we should up our spending to 5%. I mean, they're only spending 3.4%.
Yeah, but hold on, their country is enormously bigger than ours. I mean, hugely bigger than ours, and there's the amount of money they put into defence is huge. Don't forget their standard of living has risen pretty dramatically over the last 20 years, whereas ours has not really risen very far. I don't think it's a question of GDP. I think we have to spend on what we need, and I cannot tell you exactly what that is. Do we need tanks? Well, I think we do, because they seem to be going quite well in Russia, Ukraine. But what else do we need? We obviously need to spend a lot more on drones. We need to spend a lot more on equipment in general. We haven't. I mean, you know about the Russian ships in the Baltic and so on, potentially cutting our cables across the Baltic Sea. We need to be spending money on ships as well. We've got to have this stuff to spend. Otherwise, our opponents will be just laughing at us.